All right, folks, welcome back for another Riftbound 101 episode. This is episode 22, and it is a very different episode than what we've been doing so far. I'm calling this episode Winning More, Not Winning Always, which is, I think, a different take on an episode I did very early on, a couple months back, called How to Improve. And I think this is going to be maybe the first of a more theoretical kind of episode where I'm going to be talking a little bit about game theory and how to improve and drawing on insights, especially from a field that I'm much more knowledgeable about, which is Magic the Gathering. Now, I'm not going to be talking about Magic, but I am going to be bringing in the work of pro players and people who write a lot about Magic to sort of discuss how to approach Riftbound and how to approach your own play in a way that's going to be more rewarding. And also bringing in events that are happening all around the community currently, like the Fuzhou Open. So, the plan for this episode to talk about winning more is going to be to start where all wins really start for me, which is losing. And thinking about what triggers losses and how you think about them and how you improve. Followed by agency. So what can you do? What is in your power? Variance, things like luck. And then thinking through something that we call winning lines or finding your line, depending on where you come from. It's a term that you can find in poker as well. And finally, I think some behavioral and attitudinal changes for improving. Now, I want to be upfront. This is not going to be an episode that is a purely statistical game theory, how to improve at a mathematical level kind of episode, because I'm not really a quantitative person. I use a lot of data and I inform my play with data, but I am much more of an intuitive thinker and I work in the qualitative or more artistic parts of game critique. But I think there's a lot to learn that will be useful for you to think through Riftbound. So, one of the things I hear a lot from new players and advanced players, but certainly from new players, is I lost. How could this happen? How did I get here? What did I do wrong? And this to me is the primary indicator that losses are a trigger for self-reflection and assessment. In a lot of the other videos I've been making, I tell you, assess how your play is going and what you can do to change it. And that usually comes from losses, because wins will often make you think that you are doing everything correctly, which is obviously not the case. And you can see from the Fuzhou Open that happened this weekend, ACC Muck having like a really bad time, and there's going to be a lot of spoilers for this event, so just warning for that. During a match where he's playing Yi, and he's just trying to play out units to the board and trying to get some kind of advantage, but he's getting run over, right? He doesn't feel good about it. And this is a day 2 match. So we're talking about top 64 players, some of which are much more veteran than others. And this is an indicator to me that there are kind of different perspectives on how loss occurs. If you ever watch Limited Resources, one of my favorite shows from Magic, hosted by Luis Scott Vargas, who's a Hall of Famer in Magic, and Marshall Sutcliffe, who's been casting Magic for decades at this point. They often talk about the perspectives of newer players versus veterans. And it's not that one loses and the other doesn't, because veterans lose all the time too. It's that they attribute losses to different things. So for example, a newer player might tell me, I lost because I didn't draw my answers. A veteran might tell me, I misplayed in a specific turn and used my answer that I could have kept. Conversely, a newer player might tell me, they had the nuts, they drew everything, how could I compete? Veteran will tell me, there's variance, it happens. Sometimes it happens to me, sometimes it happens to my opponent. And lastly, my deck just loses to theirs, which is like a very defeatist kind of approach, which sometimes is appropriate, but often will be replaced by something like, what's my winning line when you're a player? And the reason why I put Draven up on screen is I think this is going to be a very common refrain as Draven enters the meta, the same way that I hear it now when people pull up against Kaisa or Aurora, MFE, or Annie. And I say this as somebody who's almost exclusively been competing with either Yasuo or Set. Like, I run into bad matchups all the time, but there are different ways to approach those matchups and to think through things. So an example of this is, I think everybody is familiar with rock, paper, scissors, right? So a standard three-way game. Rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper, paper beats rock. And whenever you throw, unless somebody's cheating, you have kind of a perfectly even chance to win, lose, or tie across all three. Now, imagine if you showed up to a game and week after week you met the same player and they were always on scissors, right? Or paper. They would tell you, like, I am a paper player. And so you as a player can choose to continue playing rock, or sometimes you can make different choices. You too can start playing paper, you too can start playing scissors. God, I'm confusing myself with my own metaphors. But it's not that one is unbeatable, and we'll get to the Draven unbeatable sort of discussion in a little bit, but it's the fact that there are different ways to approach this situation. And so the answer would be, instead of saying, I am a kind of player, you could ask, how do I beat the kind of player that I'm seeing a lot of, right? So if you're always playing paper and you always lose to rock, how do I beat scissors? And so you start like changing your perspective on things because you're asking process questions about how to improve. This is effectively what happened with Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa was run very quickly, and this always happens with games where aggressive decks are somewhat easier to figure out because they do things that are very proactive and easy to read. Kai'Sa plays units with might that scale very well, units and spells that don't cost a lot, and good removal. And so it's very obvious that decks like this are going to be a bit easier to figure out than something that requires a bit more fine-tuning, is a bit more responsive. This is how you get Yi. And from the binary of Kai'Sa and Yi, you start to get newer other kinds of decks that are, somewhat favored or unfavored into either deck. The implication is that people kept losing to these decks before they figured out how to beat them, right? We had to make different choices. If you take, for example, the top 64 of the event that just happened in China, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about like nerfing Draven. And I'm not saying that's an incorrect discussion, but in the meantime, before that happens, there is a reality that you're going to have to deal with Draven or Irelia and some amount of other decks. And so your options are going to be play decks that lose to Draven, play decks that beat Draven, or play Draven. And then you have like another option, which is just play whatever you like and, improvement be damned or winning more be damned, which is a completely valid answer, especially if you're not a competitive player. You can just put in reps on the deck that you like and become better with it. However, there are things that are in your agency, right? So, for example, I think that Bryn Here Thundersong is a tool that red decks are currently using that is kind of stomping on green decks. This card blocks reactive spells from having their appropriate timing, and it is something that is hard to respond to if you're not playing a certain kind of deck, right? So what is in your power is to locate what you can do to counter this. We had a very similar thing happen in set 1 where a lot of people made the in a vacuum call that Dreaming Tree, pictured at the bottom left, was the best battlefield because it gave you the most card advantage. And slowly people started to figure out that too many decks were getting advantage out of this, and so it was in your best interest to not play it, or to play a battlefield that was a little bit less good, but that gave only your deck value, right? And so we've moved from generically good battlefields to asymmetrically good battlefields more and more. And this is a bit of an oversimplification, but you get the idea is that there are actions that you can take as a player to improve your chances of winning, improve your experience of play, and also to build, better muscle with this kind of stuff. So things that are in your control, I tend to slot these into like two different categories. There's material things that are in your control and there's immaterial. And so when you show up to an event, the first thing that you can do is decide what deck you bring. You can also tech it. You can tech the main board. You can also change the sideboard. Then there's a material practice, which is before the event, which is practice, right? Going to other Nexus nights, going to smaller events. And especially if you're playing in longer events, I can attest to this, your physical state matters a lot. The kind of food that you eat, whether or not you're hydrated, whether or not you got good sleep the night before, all these things matter in how well you play. And so if you show up to an event and you're super dehydrated and you slept like 1 hour and you're super stressed out, you're going to have a bad time. So you can take some actions to like change these things. There's also some immaterial stuff like your attitude and mood. Playing on tilt is one of these, and these are really like things that are psychological that you can sort of build up a tolerance over time, or have practices that like recontextualize how the game is going. Like this video, right? Consuming material that makes you better will invariably improve your headspace and how you feel about the game. And so I tend to do this a lot when I'm playing decks that I feel unfavored with. So like I bring Yasuo a lot, and Yasuo was not a favorite deck for a very long time into Kaisa and Annie. And so it was a choice I was making, but there were other things I could do to improve. I could tech what was in the deck to better perform in those events. However, there are many things which are out of your control. So material things like matchups, your opponent's tech choices, dice rolls for first player. These are like super invariable, or they're variable in general, but you don't have agency in them. And then there are things like your health, right? I do make like I don't want to overstate the like get good sleep thing, but sometimes you can't control that. And that will certainly matter. And if you're sick, or you've had something like terrible happen to you, like these things will affect how you play. Round timers are also part of this. I know many people who are much slower players, and so the round timer itself is out of your control. But for example, practicing so that you play your deck faster is in your control. And then the immaterial part of this is exactly the flip of what you do, right? So your opponent's attitude, their energy levels, how aggressive or angry they are at the table, and other external factors like people walking around, talking. I suppose those could be material as well. All this to say, every like situation where you're playing a game, and Riftbound is no different than like a game of poker, has a lot of internal and external factors, and some are in your control and some are not. And the key to increasing your wins is to really take a look at everything that's on your side of the aisle and to start working on that as much as possible. So instead of thinking like I am, a paper player, like by default, this is who I am, this is what I have access to, think I choose to be a paper player, or I make certain choices, which gives you agency, it makes you active. And once you realize that this is a choice that you make actively, that you commit to, then you realize that it is a choice that you can change, or you can commit to and then make changes within that larger decision to increase your EV, right, your expected value. And I think the primary question for this is like, what deck do you choose, right? I'm speaking for myself. We are nearing Spirit Forged in like 3 weeks in Canada, and I'm going to have to make a choice whether I want to play Draven and really bite the bullet and play a deck that is appealing to me, but not something that I would want to choose. Or if I play Azir, a deck that I absolutely am in love with, but I'm not sure is well suited for the current metagame. And so I can either play Draven and expect everyone to target me constantly, or I can play Azir and get some EV off of people not knowing what I'm playing and have to tech it to the metagame. Both of these choices are going to come with limitations and opportunities. And as soon as I commit to this, I know that I have now settled into this direction, and I'm going to make some micro choices. I'm not going to flip flop between the two. I might do some proxy testing here and there, but once I'm in, I'm in. Like once I'm showing up to Nexus Nights, once I'm showing up to skirmishes, I'm trying to learn as much as possible about how my deck works and how I can get better at it. And I think, quite frankly, I didn't do this as much with Origins. I was really trying to figure out what colors I liked in this game, what heroes I wanted to play. Whereas when I play Magic or when I was playing Legends of Runeterra, I knew a lot more about my own preferences, which might be the case for you as well. So this is like your primary, axis of control is automatically like, what deck do you bring? And once you commit to that, you already know the kinds of things that you're going to be favored or unfavored into. A good example is looking at the Riftdex win matrix, where you can see Kaisa and Annie are generally favored or even into most matchups, with the exception of Annie into Jinx, a matchup that you don't really see all that much. And these are lifetime wins, right? So this is going to vary over time as well. Master Yi is, however, generally even into most of the high order matchups and wins into a lot of the random field around it. So if I had a different choice to make, and I knew if I had this data on hand when I was starting Origins, I think personally I would have committed to Master Yi instead of fiddling around with Set and Yasuo as much as I did. Right? I played from positions of relative um, uncertainty or precarity. And going into Spirit Forged, we don't really have a lot of that data, right? This is currently what's on the Rift matrix, like the matrix for the Rift-X website. And 29 matches is basically nothing. Like this could all be chalked up to who has learned the deck better, what kind of matchups did they go into? Did people intentionally draw in certain tournaments to get better placement? Like all these things factor into these matchups way too much. However, I will tell you, based on me watching a lot of online scrims, that Master Yi into Draven does feel like a really bad matchup. It's certainly not a 0%, but it might be something like an 80-20 or 70-30, which would be pretty abysmal, right? Again, not saying Draven should not be banned or errated or that there shouldn't be some changes to how combat works. I think that's a different discussion altogether. I'm just trying to talk about like the choices that you make when you show up with a deck or that you commit to it, and especially if you're buying the cards, right? You're making a pretty, I don't want to say final, but like a choice that has weight because you are committing money to it. And I think a lot in my work about Reid Duke's lineup theory. So for folks who don't know, Reid Duke is a Magic Hall of Famer. He's still active now. He's producing content. He drafts a ton. And Reid's lineup theory is sort of a discussion of his dad's, like kit of paintbrushes, which allows him to use the right tool for the right job. And so when I go to my local Nexus nights, I'm often just testing out decks for fun. But if I'm lining up for a tournament, I'm not going to be testing things out for fun as much. I'm going to start thinking about how I can win. And in my relative field, what is the right tool for me to win? And what am I able to access with my resources, money, card stock? So sometimes, for many of you right now, it is not possible to access a Draven deck or a Miracle, purple deck, or Kaisa or Aurora. These are expensive decks. The cards are limited. But if, like me, you decide that you want to play Yasuo for $30, you can just get very good at that one deck and win over a lot of people that you're seeing in your locals or even at smaller end events. I think it changes a little bit when you get very high up into competitive play, but the general theory, I think, works quite well. And all of these recommendations are always mitigated by variance. This is always like the thing that newer players come back to, and they're going to say, I lost because I drew dead. It's not my fault. In Magic, you're going to hear like I got mana flooded or I got mana screwed a ton. And Runeterra is a system that in general does away with some of that because of the more dependable way that runes are channeled. But you can still draw dead. And there's always going to be some degree of variance inside your games, which you cannot do anything about. Now, the proportion of what can be attributed to variance, I think, is where a lot of people are disagreeing, right? A lot of newer players are going to say this was variance, and veterans might tell you, actually, you could have mulliganed differently, you could have made different choices, you could have sequenced your plays or planned out your turns in advance, such that you were less vulnerable to variance. And so if we go back to that example of the rock, paper, scissors, right? This is kind of pure variance. You will win 33% of the time, you will lose 33% of the time, and you will draw against a stranger. However, if you start playing against a person, these ratios are going to start to vary. You're going to know that they have a preference for something, or that you're going to try to bait them because you understand how they work psychologically. There are differences already. In card games, you're going to run into mirrors. So if you run into a mirror match, if the deck is perfectly the same, which it rarely is, you're automatically going to begin at 50%, and that's going to be inflected by starting player. And once you know who the starting player is, it's going to dictate battlefield choices for rounds 2 and 3, very likely. And then you can, over weeks, you can start to tech out stuff. So it's never going to be like a pure 50%. And in the case of favored unfavored matchups, you're probably going to start at like a 70-30 matchup rate or 60-40, and you're going to try to find more or less wins depending on what you can do. And so in all three of these situations, no matter what the original, percentage was, there will always be human factors that will start intervening and messing with the regular variance. And inside of a game as well, the cards that you're drawing, you can bait certain cards. You can try to play around bad draws, and it's not going to win you every game, but it will certainly make bad games feel less bad and good games feel better. So I think there's a lot of pie charts when you see these, which is going to tell you like 75% of the games are up in the air and 25% are either winnable or automatically wins or automatically losses. And it's really in that 75% that you're trying to convert that into a win. I, think about this a lot. Playing Yasuo, I play the shell that I play. I play a very low unit count shell, and sometimes I will just draw no units. I will just not draw no 2-drops, like Mask or like Azonia's, and I'm gonna feel like I had a bunk draw, right? But I made the choice to build the deck that way. And if I'm mulliganing to avoid that, I can mitigate some of those losses. If I know the speed of the deck that I'm playing at, sometimes seemingly bad hands will turn into good hands. If I'm on, like double or triple mask, in a lot of matchups, I wouldn't like that. But if I'm in a mirror, I'm going to love it because it's going to let me trade unit to unit over. And so luck is certainly a factor, but it is absolutely relative because it's only a question of variance in terms of cards. And yeah, you're going to run hot and you're going to run cold. And the real key is to not let that get to you psychologically. Thinking through Reid's discussion of this, right, is how the very best players that he knows feel about variance and feel about luck. And in general, people who are losing at very high, high brackets of play are going to just take a high proportion of responsibility for that. They're going to say, I could have planned differently. I could have built my deck differently. I could have mulliganed differently. I could have, I could have. There's going to be a sequence of insertions of personal agency to mitigate variance. And people who don't do that, I think, are going to run into kind of a spiral downward. We're going to say, well, there was nothing I could do. I drew poorly. My opponent drew well. My resources channeled in the wrong direction. And even if you tell them, I made my deck poorly, they might say, well, I got lucky. I got unlucky with my card pulls. I could never make these decks because I didn't get access to certain kinds of product. These are not inconsequential claims, and I'm not saying they're not true, but there's room to find, a margin in those situations. And when you realize, I think Reid's final line here is, since only one player can be the winner of given tournaments, is that eventually everyone is losing way more than they win, right? Eventually, only one player out of 500, 1,000, whatever the event size is going to be that person who won constantly and never had a loss to look back onto and to think through and to find new ways to work with. Now, what that refers to is what, poker players and Magic players call the line. So the concept of the line, I would usually define as the idea of, how do I get from where I am currently to a win state? How do I close out this game winning? What is my line between my position and that situation? A sequence of actions or events or eventualities. And I'm going to give you an example of this because I think in general, people are going to say, oh yeah, I know what the right line is or what the correct line is. And I think a lot about this Collins Mullen article that I read 5 or 6 years back, which is really the idea that a lot of people will settle for a good line instead of the best line, right? They're going to accept or plan for something that is reasonably dependable and fine, but not necessarily what sets them up the most for a win. And thinking through best lines with eventualities is going to make you better because you're not just thinking how do I get out of this pothole that I'm in currently? How do I change the entire way I'm approaching this game so that I will produce the best situations for myself going forward. And obviously, you can do this inside of a match, you can do this inside of a round, you can do this inside of an event. But when you start doing that consistently across events, across a season, across a game, you're going to get better because you're constantly doing it and you get into the habit of thinking, what makes me win the most? And even if you are somebody who wants to main a hero and you say, well, I want to play Ari, and Ari's not the most winning hero, you're eliminating like one level of agency that you have access to, which is the hero choice. But within that, you can still think through like, how do I tune this deck so that it works the best for the field that I'm playing into and the battlefields that I see a lot. About a week and a half ago, I was at a skirmish locally, smaller event, about like 12 players registered, only 8 stuck, really, really small. And I went in with Yasuo, and I was expecting to run into a ton of Kai'Sa and a ton of Yi. And instead, 5 people were on Yasuo. So I ended up playing a ton of mirrors. And throughout the day, I kept seeing hidden cards, right? And I'm somebody who looks up Yasuo decks. I'm somebody who looks up purple decks. And I know that hidden cards are usually fight or flight. And the correct line is to assume that those cards are fight or flight, or maybe Azonias, and to have cards in hand that work well. So I was pushing in a unit that was even on power, and I was offering a trade, and I had in my hand, if memory serves, Discipline and Defy. And I was like, okay, if it's a fight or flight, I'm good to Defy it and Discipline. If it's Azonias, I can just Discipline. These are correct lines, right? These are lines that I was trying to score extra points to break parity, and then I was going to start like running away with the game. The winning line was actually to imagine that my opponent was playing a Teemo, which is what was actually hidden, which Discipline was too small to get through, and Defy did nothing against. And so in this one case, the correct line, which is to imagine fight or flight or Zonias, was not the winning line. But the amount of Teemo that gets played in Yasuo decks is fairly minimal. Like, I don't want to say 1 out of 10, but maybe something close to that. And so what you're speculating on is really that the correct line, the fight or flight line, is the one that will lead you to the most wins. The Teemo line is super weird, and sometimes it will like lead you to a win, but you can't always play against like these eventualities. And so understanding post facto the difference between a correct and a winning line, I think, is very important. I think a lot of people are going to say, well, I made this action and I lost, and therefore it was the incorrect line. And the truth is, you can make the correct choice and still lose. And in subsequent events, you're still going to have to make the correct choice, and you will win proportionally more than you would lose over a long period of time. And so this is a bit hard because I think a lot of people get stuck in the results-based ways of thinking, which is like, if my result was not a win, then everything I did was a mistake. And you have to kind of separate, what parts of the actions that you took, the choices that you made, were technically correct and which ones were incorrect. And also accept that your opponent having a Teemo instead of a spell that you actually can interact with is just part of the amount of variance that you can see in a game, right? It's not really a controllable vector. So when you like put these things together, I think you can start to think of games as like one of 3 scenarios. You're in an always win situation, or very likely to win, and similarly always lose or very likely to lose. And then you're in some amount of winnable, losable, right in the middle. That's where you're trying to get the most EV. And for folks who are watching the Fuzhou event, you can look at, this is the sort of game 2 of the finals between IPO2 and BTM. And there was a consistent discussion throughout the Turnham Sideways cast, which I agree with, that BTM decided to run Fiora Victorious throughout the whole tournament, and even play second on this game, so that they could play Fiora Victorious and move between battlefields, as opposed to Fiora Worthy, so that they could ready units and accelerate. And there's going to be a question that BTM is going to ask himself in weeks to come, which is, was I correct in running Fiora Victorious, or should I run Fiora Worthy? Probably going to test that a bunch. Probably going to figure out, like, in the current meta that he saw, what was the correct choice. And will make choices so that the winnable losable vector increases into always win for him as much as possible, right? And I want to showcase this because Fiora walked into this top 64 with 2 out of 64 decks. And presumably, BTM just played into Dravens all day. So it's not like he was completely off the mark, but there are some choices that he's going to have to revisit. And I'm talking about one of the best players in the game currently, in China at the very least. And Ipotu is also, I think, 2-0 now in terms of like taking home big events. So think through think through your win cases and your lose cases. And I think this is going to become super important because people are going to try to find ways to win against Draven consistently and try to find ways against the Miracle Engine, which, frankly, are overtuned, or they are very strong for the current metagame. But it may be the case that the game doesn't get a patch, or they don't get restricted or errated or banned in the near future, and then we just have to deal with them. And your choices then are do nothing, do something, or don't play the game. I personally would much rather do something. And so this brings me to the last point for today, which is improving, right? And again, I'm going to use some of Reid's work on, improving or becoming better as a player. And this is really like a 2-volley process, or a 2-volley affair. And there's a process part of this, right? Which is, if you think back to that initial event of you losing and how do you improve, this is where like a lot of the process-based stuff kicks in. So you need some reflection. You need to think on why you lost. What are the cards that you needed? What did you not see? What did you choose that lined up poorly into your opponent? Did you choose the right paintbrush for the situation? And that's going to require doing research. You're going to have to talk to people or read forums or watch videos to find other people who saw the same match, who played it, or people who are on the opposite side and are going to tell you like, this is why I beat you. This is why things worked out for me and not for you. And then you're just gonna have to practice. I'm a big proponent of playing more equals improving. It's like a correlation. It's like doing exercise. The more exercise you do, the easier it gets to do. And if you play a ton, you're gonna get better. Obviously, if you play with people who are progressing the game at the same pace as you, you're going to have the best feeling of agency because you're not going to be playing against somebody who stomps you. But also playing with the best is going to make you improve rapidly. I think playing with people who are not interested at all in winning is totally fine. And I treat it a lot as like playing a board game, but it's a different activity, right? And so these 3 like process-based recommendations, like reflect, do research, and practice, are really like simple, but I think people forget it. And I'm also guilty of showing up at like a Nexus night with a deck I've never played before. But I think of that Nexus night as practice, like it's not my event. And so, for example, for that BTM discussion, BTM is going to have to practice on Worthy and on Victorious more to figure out if one or the other is the correct choice, the way that casters thought it would be. And if not, why he feels the way that he feels, and whether or not that's going to line up into more wins in the future. There is a statistical component to this. Like we're going to have more data as we move forward. But for now, at least, people are really, trying to figure it out with their testing groups and trying to find decks that win into Draven or into purple. The other part of this is not process-based. It's attitudinal. And this is a shot of BTM just after he loses to Ipotu in the finals. And I think even as he's losing, he showcases so much enthusiasm to understand what was happening. Obviously, he's coming out second in the first Spirit Forged event, so he's feeling pretty good. But you can see like a desire to understand what's happening and why he didn't take that win. And so, much like Reid was discussing earlier, or rediscussed in 2015, but I was talking about earlier, taking responsibility for your own losses and trying to understand what happened is really like the skeleton key to improving. Because if you decide that it wasn't your fault under any circumstances, then that means there's nothing for you to do, and the game is inert to you. Like you're never going to improve because you're never going to try to do different things. If you accept that losing was in some ways due to the actions that you took or the choices that you made before or during the match, then you can change things. And I think these two things, this leads into two other things, which are like nurturing confidence. It's like practicing a lot, doing a lot of research makes you confident in the deck that you're playing. It makes you know your matchups. It makes you know what's in your deck and to have like a good idea of what positions you can play from. It's why I often recommend like picking a deck or two for a season and focusing on them as much as possible. And, you know, if you look at players who had a lot of success, obviously they test a ton, but Colin Kaiser didn't show up with anything other than set for any of the big events that I could see. He was good at set because he played set a lot. And finally, practice humility. You're going to be wrong a lot. I'm, you know, no stranger to that. I get a lot of replies on card assessments that I do in this channel, and often I get pushback in my professional life as well. Like, nobody's perfect. And I think being defensive and being standoffish doesn't help with that. And so I want to leave you with some words from Reid from that 2015 article, right? Because I think he was talking about a Magic career, but if you think about it as like your time in any given game, employing these like six, you know, tools, like reflection, research, and practice, and thinking through, like taking responsibility, nurturing confidence, and practicing humility, you're going to go a lot further than you would if you just walked in thinking that you were going to be the best, right? The other thing about this is I think these are like great tools to get you to connect with other people in the community, to make new friends, to find other people who are interested in the same hobby or professional career or competitive play as you are, so that you can get better, right? And all of these things lead you to that point where you have trust in yourself and you think that you can win. So I do think that improving over time really is going to come out of losing, and it's going to be frustrating. Like I came in second at that skirmish I was talking about, and I felt really bad because I played clean for 4 rounds, and then the fifth one was a bit messy, and the sixth one was not good. And I lost in the finals, and I try to think about what I did wrong and what tech choices I could have made, and what did I bring the right hero, and like these are all questions that I ask myself. And when I go to my next skirmish, I'm going to feel differently about it. And like, don't take my word for it, because I'm not a person who is necessarily like the best pro player or currently like competing at like Bologna or Vegas. Take the word of people who are like Hall of Fame Magic players who've been playing for like 30 years. These are tools that are good to have in your arsenal. And as the game gets older, or as you cycle from Riftbound into other card games, I think these are tools that are going to be super useful to you long term. So I hope this has been useful. This has been sort of like the first more theoretical episode about the game and about playing cards and about playing any game with variance. Like, you could take this advice and use it for poker. You could use it for chess, for backgammon. You could use it for, you know, like fighting sports. There's a lot of stuff that you can apply this kind of thinking through. So hopefully this has been useful. And next time, I will be doing a In Focus episode, which I have not decided what it's going to be yet, but I hope to be able to do more of these kinds of videos as well. So have a nice one.